And I just moved there?
Yes.
Very good. Lord Mayor and distinguished leaders of the World Ethics Institute, and ladies and gentlemen, it's really a delight to be here, a very great honor, and always a great pleasure to be in Tübingen. And thank you for the chance to reflect on these past 10 years since this very important statement on world economic ethics was launched by Hans Küng and colleagues at the United Nations in 2009. I confess that when that statement was launched, it was the first time I had ever considered the question of world ethics. The idea that there could be a common shared ethical standard across the world now seems so piercingly important and crucial to me, but it was not a subject on my mind myself. And like many in my profession of economics, I had no formal ethical training at all in philosophy, in context. And I can tell you, when I started university, which is a long time ago, 47 years ago, I wanted to study politics. And I went to the politics department of Harvard University and said that I wanted to study mathematical political science. And they told me, but first I would have to take a philosophy course of political philosophy. I said, I don't need that. So I went to the economics department, where it was absolutely not required. And I was happy to do my mathematics and learn my models, and perhaps know intuitively some of the thoughts about a social market economy. And indeed, I grew up in a household of social justice activists, and at a time when the political hero of my parents was Franklin Roosevelt, who was our great social democrat or social market president, I think the greatest president in American history. And so intuitively, I think I perhaps shared some of the ideas, but the idea of a formal structure of world ethics, the idea of Hans Küng to explore over a brilliant career the deep underpinnings of the world's major religions, to show the commonalities and the very rich common philosophies that underpin them, especially human dignity and the human rights that attach to that, is extraordinarily important. So for me, this document is not only important in its global right, but personally very important, because it really accelerated my attention to these issues. And now my wife could testify, I spend time on little else other than philosophy, and I'll explain a little bit why that is, in fact, because I think that the notion of ethics as a guide for us in the 21st century is more essential than ever, for one key reason, incidentally, and that is that the problems of economics per se are not so hard, in that we are very rich in the world. We have powerful technologies. We have great know-how. If we would organize ourselves around ethical principles, we would solve what are deemed to be impossibly hard problems. We could end extreme poverty very quickly. We could reduce social inequalities dramatically, and we could save the environment, which hangs in the balance now, because not a lack of technology, renewable energy, and alternatives, but because we cannot find the shared language and purpose even for our own survival, which is a rather stunning fact. So in a deep way, it comes back to ethics. And I'm going to argue later on, it comes back to ethics in perhaps the deepest sense of Western tradition, the ethics of Aristotle, which means a little bit different from ethics the way we use it today. But that I will discuss in a moment. What I would like to start by doing is putting this manifesto into a bit of historical context. Of course, one could start 2,000 years ago, or one could start 150 years ago, because the idea of social democracy and social market economy was also born in this country. Edward Bernstein conceived the idea of social democracy as a path somewhere between liberalism and communism, which was, or socialism at the time. And I think that vision proved to be an extraordinarily powerful vision. And one can say that social market economy and social democracy is today's representation of that vision. But I'll start at the end of World War II with the founding of the United Nations, and especially with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because in a way this is really the first codified statement of a universality of ethics adopted by governments. It's an absolutely astounding document to read, and it's a tribute to Franklin Roosevelt, and especially to his wife Eleanor Roosevelt, who brought this document to the world in 1948. Our governments would never sign such a document now. In the United States, I'm sure public opinion, not maybe the mainstream, but the radical right that we have would regard it as the most outrageous kind of claims and so on. But in 1948, after World War II, it was perhaps because of the whole world taking a breath after that most horrendous disaster, saying that we need to find a way back to basic standards that can be shared worldwide. And this document starts with something very important, which is also the starting point of the global economic ethic. It starts with the statement that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And I think it's very interesting that it puts dignity even first before rights, because the idea of human dignity is the core underpinning of what we're after, is really the predicate of rights. The rights come because of human dignity. And the Universal Declaration is about dignity first, and then the rights that attend to that human dignity. And it says that human beings are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. This is also core to the Global Economic Ethics Manifesto. Let me underscore reason, because I'm going to return to that. That's perhaps Aristotle's favorite concept. And let me also underscore conscience. That is probably Kant's core concept, in a way, our moral instinct and the responsibility that attends to our moral instinct. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was a powerful statement. It is important to remember what it has in it, actually, because it's quite wonderful, rarely read, but it is still the world's moral charter to the extent that we have one. And it calls not only for civil rights, rights of citizens in a community, political rights, rights to participate in government very clearly, but also economic and social rights. And economic rights is a very important idea. It says that everybody has the right to social security, social protection, health, education, and other basic economic needs as rights, as a matter of human dignity. This document also says that we won't have those rights achieved instantly, but that they should be achieved or realized progressively, that over time all of these rights should be achieved. That was 71 years ago. We're late because it would not be hard to achieve all of these rights. But the document itself stands as a remarkable testament to a capacity, perhaps at that historical moment, to find a common sense of human dignity and responsibility. When the Universal Declaration was put into more operational language in the 1960s in international covenants, especially around economic, social, and cultural rights, it's notable that the United States did not sign that document. It never became a party to the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Why? Because by then the idea that Franklin Roosevelt had tried to put into the U.S. context as an economic Bill of Rights in 1944 was rejected by the conservatives in the United States, saying there are no rights that are economic. Yes, there are political rights to vote or to have citizenship, but economic rights, that was called communism in the American right-wing context, and we never, therefore, even signed this covenant. It's also a measure of what happened in the United States, which is a big theme that I would like to emphasize. The U.S., like post-war Germany, had a period of social market economy. In fact, that was the mainstream from the New Deal in the United States through Lyndon Johnson in 1968. But we then left that tradition to head to the right. Our economic gurus became Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek. And they preached a classical liberalism, and that became the dominant economic paradigm, in fact. So even though we had signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we had for more than 35 years in the United States a social, democratic, political milieu under Roosevelt, Truman, even Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, we left that to head to the right, and we have never gotten out of that until today. And this is very important to understand for the developments that I'm going to describe. But the next benchmark that I wanted to discuss, in fact, is a reflection of this neoliberalism in the United States and its deviation from a social market philosophy or from a universal human rights philosophy. The Business Roundtable in the United States is a group of leading CEOs, the top business leaders of the United States, who issue statements from time to time. And in 1997, they issued a statement on the purpose of the corporation. And the statement said, the Business Roundtable wishes to emphasize that the principal objective of a business enterprise is to generate economic returns to its owners. This statement maybe seems harmless, but it's filled with mischief and danger, in fact. It followed a very remarkably influential statement by the free market economist Milton Friedman, very much in the Hayek philosophy, that businesses should just be businesses and they have no social responsibility. That if they try to do anything other than maximize the wealth of their shareholders, they're actually misusing someone else's money. After all, a CEO is just an agent of the owners, and therefore the job of that agent is to maximize the wealth of the owners and to not look at any other considerations. And this statement in 1997 was a reflection of that. On the surface, there's at least a minimal plausibility to this, and the way that Milton Friedman described it in a famous op-ed, which dramatically influenced or freed the instincts of the CEOs to do their business. He talked about a business leader choosing to use some of the income of the company for a charitable purpose, and saying that the business leader would have no right to substitute his values for the values of the owners. The owners should get the money and they can do what they want with the money. But what Friedman did not counter with at all is the real harm of this statement, which is that if your goal is to maximize the wealth of the shareholder, it also instructs you to take whatever actions you can to maximize that wealth, even if it's at the harm of others in society, even if it is through extremely aggressive practices, even if it is through cheating, as it became the norm in American corporate performance. Because cheating, if you get caught, that's a cost of doing business, but the chance of getting caught is actually very low, partly because these companies pay politicians to relax the enforcement rules and to cut down the size of the enforcement agencies, and so they know that they won't get caught. Incidentally, one of the most famous cases of this, which affected Germany very much, was a swindle of the investment bank Goldman Sachs together with a hedge fund headed by a man named John Paulson, a ne'er-do-well that I sit next to at an annual dinner and shudder all through the dinner, but I do it for sociological interest, I tell my wife. And you may recall that the bank and this hedge fund manager swindled a German bank of about $1 billion of investments, the IKB bank, by selling knowingly toxic assets to the bank, which then went broke. And Paulson, who had bet against those assets as part of the plan, made $1 billion overnight. And you know what? Not only was he not put in jail, not only was he not fined, he became a hero of Wall Street. And he took the German bank's money and he put $400 million of it into Harvard University in endowment. And I recommended that they call it the IKB Engineering School, but they instead called it the Paulson Engineering School. But this is how the swindle operated. The point I'm making is that the Business Roundtable gave freedom to companies. Your job is to make money. You don't have to look any other way. It's an explicit invitation to put aside any kind of ethical considerations, in fact, and that's what American business, by and large, did. By 2009, we were in the midst of a massive global financial crisis. And mind you, it had originated, without doubt, on Wall Street, a couple miles from where we live and where we have dinner with these people once a year, just once a year, but where we meet them once a year. It had originated because of fraudulent financial practices, massive leverage, and absolute lack of oversight by regulators who included the Fed chair, Alan Greenspan, who in our political context is a follower of Ayn Rand. I don't know if Ayn Rand means too much here. She is a lousy novelist who in the American context is called a philosopher. It's very weird. But she wrote a few very terrible novels, but basically said, you should let the rich and powerful do what they will do because they're the great men of society. We had a Federal Reserve Board chairman who believed that. And he did let them do what they would do. And by 2009, there was a massive financial crisis. And this is the context. It's not the origin of this statement because the World Ethics Foundation had been working along these lines for many years, but the launch of the statement was in the context of the worst global economic crisis since the Great Depression. And the statement in the economic ethics says nothing less than the experience of the current crisis affecting the whole economic sphere underlines the need for those internationally accepted ethical principles and moral standards which we all need to breathe life into in our day-to-day business practices. This was literally a diagnosis of the financial crisis, not just a general statement that we should behave ourselves, but it's an accurate statement of the profound fraudulent behavior that contributed to this massive crisis. And in the US context, absolutely nobody was held accountable. As you know, nobody went to jail. Nobody was held to personal account. When the crisis broke out, I called Senator Obama's campaign team to say that I could help them a little bit to discuss how the crisis came. And I said, just one thing, please don't deal with the Wall Street banks on solving this thing. They made the crisis. And I suggested that he avoid certain people. And then the next day there was Senator Obama with Robert Rubin, who was the Treasury Secretary, who had liberalized and ended all of the regulations. And his team became the advisors on the bailout. Well, you know how that went. It meant that there was complete impunity, no accountability at all. The World Ethics Statement came in that context, and it called for a global economic ethic that relies on moral principles and values that from time immemorial have been shared by all cultures and have been supported by common practical experience. It is a wonderful document. It is based on key principles of responsibility. And there are 4 that are highlighted. The principle of humanity, which is the principle of human dignity, and that is completely in line with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A set of basic values: respect for life, respect for nature, the rule of law, and the suppression of dishonesty. The call for honesty and tolerance in business dealings, and the call for mutual esteem and partnership. I think one of the key points, obvious but very, very central, is the statement, it is legitimate to pursue one's own interests, but the deliberate pursuit of personal advantage to the detriment of one's partners, that is, with unethical means, is irreconcilable with sustainable economic activity to mutual advantage. So it is a doctrine of non-maleficence, do no harm. And this is the core starting point of morality in business. It is in addition to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is about the rights of individuals, and what the Global Economic Ethos Manifesto added was the principles of fair business as a core shared principle. That's not part of any global agreement, but the idea of this ethical call is that it needs to be central, and I think more and more we see that that is precisely the case. By 2015, alas, we had not only entered a period of profound impunity, inequality, soaring wealth of those who had been bailed out, like Mr. Paulson and others, but also deepening poverty, partly as the result of the financial crisis itself. And because of the polarization in societies, in Germany, in the United States, throughout Europe and elsewhere, with the refugee crisis and other crises. We saw the rise of the far right in the United States, in Europe and elsewhere, growing hate, growing social exclusion. But on top of that, we also could see, because we had failed to act on it, an absolutely dramatic, roiling, out of control environmental crisis. Climate change is only one of the 3 environmental disasters. Also the destruction of biodiversity and the mega pollution in all parts of the world. We are ripping apart nature and seemingly unable to stop ourselves. So 2015 marked 2 more important milestones, in my view, for us on this path. The first was a most remarkable encyclical by Pope Francis, Laudato Si', which I regard as one of the great encyclicals of the modern papacy. The Church has been grappling with questions of moral economy in modern times since 1891, since the encyclical Rerum Novarum, which was the first Church teachings about industrialization. And the basic point of the Church's social doctrines is that, like the global economic ethic, an economy needs a moral framework. Property rights are not inviolable. The common good is the purpose of the economy, not private property per se. So it is a social market philosophy that the Church has had, in essence, since 1891, and the several social teachings that have followed that. Pope Francis takes this great tradition and, I think, expands it and extends it brilliantly. His main purpose in this encyclical is to put the ecological crisis in the context of the Church's social teachings, but I think he goes even beyond that. The core concept of this wonderful encyclical is integral ecology. The idea is that our fundamental human nature and our fundamental well-being is on the basis of relations, and that's what he calls ecology. And by integral ecology, he means our relations with each other and our relations with nature, and that both of these must be attended to on a moral basis if we are to be able to preserve and protect the dignity of human beings. So the encyclical has 3 fundamental philosophical points. First is holism, or the interconnectedness of humanity, of us as each other, as well as us with nature, that there's no pulling apart of humans on one side, nature on the other side. We are part of this interconnectedness. Second is a core concept, which I very much love, of the Catholic Church, that in English we call the universal destination of goods, which says that fundamentally the world belongs to everybody. It doesn't just belong to the billionaires who happen to have the money in their bank accounts. And there is a responsibility, a right of each person to have what they need for human dignity. And there is a corresponding responsibility of those who have excess to meet those needs. And in this concept, there's a wonderful quotation of St. Ambrose in the year 380, quoted by Pope Paul VI in his encyclical Populorum Progressio, where St. Ambrose says, when a rich person gives to a poor person, he is not making a gift to the poor person, he is restituting what is the poor person's possessions. So he is returning what already is owned and owed to the poor person. In other words, there is the fundamental rights to human dignity. Economic rights are part of that, and the goods of the world belong to everybody in that sense. And the third part of this encyclical that I like very much, which I'm going to emphasize in just a moment, is what Pope Francis calls conversion. And conversion means awakening to these realities. It means the ability to come to understand our state of affairs and how we have to change our behavior. I call it the cultivation of virtues, that there is an active process of individual responsibility to understand our situation, to understand integral ecology, and to act accordingly. I think it's extraordinarily important to put ethics in this term of not just Kantian deontological responsibility that you have a duty to do something, but rather to the waking up of one's own human nature, that this is the way that one should live for a proper life. And this is in Pope Francis's writings, conversion, and in Aristotle's thoughts, the cultivation of virtues. One of the key things that Pope Francis writes in Laudato Si is that interdependence obliges us to think of one world with a common plan. This is a wonderful statement. Pope Francis made it here at the rostrum of the UN General Assembly on September 25th, 2015, in opening the General Assembly in 2015, calling on the world leaders for a common plan based on human dignity and our need for survival. And immediately at the end of the Pope's address to the world leaders, the world's governments unanimously adopted the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. So this is the next milestone that I want to stress. The world governments, whether they know it or not, mine certainly doesn't know it. And by the way, don't tell them, because he would try to do damage to it. But most of the other governments know, and they're trying to implement an agenda of sustainable development. Sustainable development is a social market or social democratic philosophy that adds something that social market philosophy did not have at the start, and that's the ecological element. I believe it didn't have it because it was not really known as an issue, and it was obviously not as recognized. But the core of sustainable development, as meant by these agreements, is social justice aligned with economic development. And now it is these 5 points: ending extreme poverty, which is the first sustainable development goal; promoting social inclusion, including gender equality and reduced income inequality; ensuring environmental sustainability, both in climate and ecosystems, and ending the killing pollution; enforcing the rule of law, which is SDG 16, and fostering partnerships, SDG 17. It is a global social democratic or social market philosophy. I tell my friends that SDGs, which stands for Sustainable Development Goals, is actually social democratic goals, because I think that this is really what has been done, and it is Europe's championing of these values that have made it possible to have a global agreement. But in a sense, these goals, the 17 goals, really hark back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as well. Most of them are a restatement of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights: ending poverty, ensuring health care for all, ensuring education for all. But it is our generation's attempt, once again, to actually implement and realize these rights that have been notionally with us for more than 70 years, but are still woefully unmet. Now, final milestone to bring us to today, the Business Roundtable came back again 22 years later. They said, oops, maybe we exaggerated a little bit because we want to run these CEOs out of town, actually. They have behaved so badly. The head of the Business Roundtable, someone I know and very likable person in person, Jamie Dimon, is the head of JP Morgan Chase. But his bank has invested tens of billions of dollars in new oil and gas projects in the last 3 years after the Paris Climate Agreement was signed. No responsibility whatsoever. Well, there is a growing backlash in the United States because our society is so divided now and really out of control. I'll come to that in a moment. That the Business Roundtable itself made a statement that says, now each of our stakeholders is essential. We commit to deliver value to all of them for the future success of our companies, our communities, and our country. We're going to try to hold them to that. Don't hold your breath, but it's interesting that they have changed their tune. It's not quite a mea culpa. It wasn't quite an apology, but it is a reflection of reality. And it's a reflection of how many corporate scandals we've had, how badly behaved the companies are, and how corrupted the American political system has become, actually. Because so much of the collapse of regulation comes from the fact that each election cycle now costs $6 to $8 billion, paid for by the companies and by the richest people in the United States who have owned the political process and have created the kind of injustice and impunity that has led us to these multiple crises. Well, the fact is we have advanced, therefore, in concepts, and the World Economic Ethics Manifesto is an important part of that milestone of building an ethics and building a vision of a world social market economy. That is one that is fair as well as prosperous and one that is sustainable as well as developed. But we find ourselves, as you very well know, absolutely on the edge right now. We are close to squandering the most marvelous heritage of knowledge, science, technology, and wealth imaginable because of a lack of self-control and a lack of proper ethical behavior. Where are we? We are with the forest fires burning around the world, in the boreal regions of Europe, in the Amazon, as in this picture, in the tropical rainforests of Indonesia, because there is no self-control. Because Bolsonaro in Brazil has sent in illegal miners and loggers and ranchers and farmers to take land and disdainfully said at the podium of the United Nations last week, no one will tell us what to do, which is exactly the opposite of a world ethic of responsibility. And we're there because of, how could you vote for this? Well, the good news today is maybe he really will be thrown out. He is a crook and he is a psychopath. And he is a great danger to the world. And it has been clear that he is utterly out of control. And it's been terrifying for us because I'm not sure that people around the world fully appreciate that he's not a clown or just a clever politician or with the antics of a bully, but he is an extraordinarily dangerous, deranged individual. And the derangement is on full view this week, which is quite stunning. So far, it hasn't mattered for his supporters or his party. He once said that he could shoot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue and nothing would change. And he's close to putting that to the test, making overtly illegal statements on the air day by day, breaking the law, glorifying in it, and seeing what he can get away with. And so this is also, to my mind, not just a horrible accident of our politics, and also a reflection of a society that is confused, divided, in despair in some ways, so one that could go along with a con man like this, but also a reflection certainly of our state of ethics, in that it is absolutely the case in the United States for a large part of our population that they know that this is a man of personal ethical irresponsibility, but don't see the link of that with whether or not to support him as President of the United States. This is a terrifying reality, known all too well in this country's history also. If we can't understand that the ethical standards of leaders are central for our safety and survival, we won't make it. And this is an idea so basic that we have lost, so that this man was supported by preachers up and down the country, supposedly the evangelical Christians and all the rest, because he would put in the right kind of judges, or he would give a tax cut, or he would do something else. And they would say, we acknowledge that on a personal level he's irresponsible, probably a tax cheat and so forth, but put him in a position of power nonetheless. So what do? This is a dangerous moment, not just because of Mr. Trump, but because the global climate system is on the edge of runaway global warming, because societies around the world are divided. So we're holding on in a fragile way. The concepts have been built in important ways. The Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement are extraordinarily important handholds for us, because they are globally agreed and they are right and they are important in what they say. But how do we get society and our governments and our politicians and our businesses to adhere to this clear path of what we need for survival and for well-being? Well, I want to add one more concept that I think needs more conceptual elaboration as part of our growing mix of tools and our calls for ethics, and that is the ethics of ancient Greece, which I think makes a core point that we need to take on. And that is back to the School of Athens and to Plato and Aristotle, but I'm going to especially talk about the young man to the right, who is Aristotle, carrying his book of ethics in the hand, of course, painted by Raphael in 1511. But the Ethics is the book that Aristotle purportedly wrote for his son Nicomachus. It's the Nicomachean Ethics. And the point that is important for me in Aristotle's thinking is that ethics was not for him the Kantian idea of right and wrong. It wasn't what you have to do as your duty. Ethics for Aristotle was how to live a good life. So it was, what should you do? It was good advice from the father to the son, not telling him you must do this and you must do that, because that is the categorical imperative, which has its importance, but rather this is how to achieve a thriving life. And ethics comes from the Greek word, ethos, which actually comes from the root habit. So what Aristotle was telling his son is, form good habits of behavior. Learn to behave well by behaving well. Follow good mentors, get a good education, and importantly, cultivate excellences of character, virtues. And this is the essence of how to achieve a good life. Eudaimonia in Greek. How to achieve a good life? It's achieved through the excellence of human reason. And I like the fact that in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it starts with reason. It says people are due their dignity and their rights. Why? Because of human reason. And this goes back to the ancient Greek idea. What makes human beings able to live a good life above the life of other animals? And it is that uniquely human beings have reason, and they can cultivate that reason to control their instincts, to control their worst behaviors, to cultivate responsible relations with others, and to be good citizens. And so the core of Aristotle's advice to Nicomachus is build character. And building character became the four cardinal virtues of practical wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. And for all of those, Aristotle said, maintain moderation, build the habits of good behavior, understand that cheating or greed or avarice will lead you in a direction of unhappiness, not just in a direction of illegality or breaking the rules. And Aristotle put a great emphasis on the role of education, mentorship, habits, and contemplation to cultivate these virtues. And it's very nice, almost unbelievable in our political context, that Aristotle wrote two books side by side. One was the Ethics and the other was the Politics. If you're an academic, you can be insanely jealous because he invented the field of ethics with the first book, he invented the field of political science with the second book. But worse than that, they're the best books ever written on the subject, actually. Everything else, we try to come close. But already 2,350 years ago, he wrote these masterpieces. But on the Politics, the reason it goes with the Ethics is for him, politics is just ethics at the scale of the community, nothing else. You can't have good government without an ethical population. You can't have an ethical population without good government. So all of the Politics is asking, how can we make the combination of institutions and mentorship and education so that the polity, the polis, can live in an ethical manner so that people can achieve the good life. So this adds the last concept, I think, for me. We are after dignity, rights, responsibilities, as in the World Economic Ethics, and the cultivation of virtues. We need to help entrain the notions, once again, in our business people that we train in business schools, among economists that, God forbid, should have some ethical training, and among our children as well. What does it mean to live with the virtues of excellence of reason in order to be able to live a good life? So I say that happiness or well-being is achieved by cultivating virtue. It is social, and the virtues apply at all levels. Just like you can have a virtuous country or polity, as well as a virtuous individual, we need the virtuous corporation. How should a virtuous corporation behave? Not by doing whatever it takes to make money, but by the precepts in the global economic ethics. We need a virtuous behavior of organizations at all scales, and we need an ecological virtue as well, which is our responsibility to other species and our responsibility to nature. cultivating these virtues is not a choice anymore. It is fundamental for our survival. What are some of the practical steps? Better care for all children in the world, because Aristotle rightly taught already 2,350 years ago, young children must be cultivated in their well-being. By the time they're adults, it's too late. There must be education about values, education about virtuous behavior. The notions of global citizenship, which are embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals, are fundamental. We have rising nationalism, once again, how utterly destructive it is and how completely wrong-headed it is at a time in world history where global cooperation is the most fundamental need to achieve anything for any individual country. And so the whole idea that Trump goes to the podium of the General Assembly and attacks globalists because he's a nationalist for America first is so twisted a misunderstanding of our real state of affairs that it comes from, in his case, also a profound ignorance as well as psychopathy that we need to help to overcome. We need to train in justice, ecological stewardship, and we need to turn companies back to their original meaning, cum pani, with bread. It was how you broke bread with your fellows is what a company is. It was not to steal money from some unsuspecting bank. It was how to break bread with others. And of course, we need a holism and a universalism. The Weltethos-Institut is a perfect exemplar of that. Universities are a perfect exemplar of that. Universities have an absolutely special role to play in this. I love the Greek word for university, pan epistemio, all knowledge. It is exactly what we need to bring to bear in order to solve these problems. And finally, we need what Aristotle, at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, calls the highest joy of all, and that is the joy of philosophy, the joy of contemplation. He was convinced he had the best job in the world, and I think that he had a lot of merit to that. Let me just end with mentioning a wonderful initiative that Pope Francis is leading that will take place in Assisi next March, the economy of Francesco. In this case, Francesco refers to Saint Francis and the idea of an integral ecology. What Pope Francis has done is to invite hundreds of young economists from around the world, and a few old gray hairs too, to talk about what a new economic model and economic system can be. And the World Economic Ethics Manifesto I will make sure that it does play an important role in the deliberations next March. And I hope, and I'm sure that I can count on the Institute Weltethos to participate in this important setting, because I think that this is the course that we need to redefine our way of thinking about our lives together and how the economy relates, to implement a social market philosophy for the world. And we have a good advance with the Sustainable Development Goals to do it, and to understand that if we would calm down and gain some self-understanding and self-control, we have more than enough for everybody on the planet and more than enough means to save ourselves from the ecological crises that we have created. Thank you very much.